Welcome again to TMS Web Academy. I am Wagner Landgraf. I am the product manager for TMS Business, a line of products from TMS Software. And this webinar is about introducing ORM with Delphi and TMS Aurelius. Thank you for coming. And this webinar will be a very basic one, an introduction to ORM and Aurelius. So I'll explain here what an ORM is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using an ORM, and explain a little bit how to use TMS Aurelius, which is an ORM for Delphi. And also at the end of the webinar, I will mention about TMS Aurelius Academy Edition, which is a new license, free license for TMS Aurelius. All right. So let's start. What is ORM? It's an acronym for Object Relational Mapping, or sometimes referred to Object Relational Mapper, which is a tool that does object relational mapping. And if we use our good old friend Wikipedia here, we can see that it says that object relational mapping, ORM, is a programming technique for converting data between incompatible type systems using object-oriented programming language. It also mentions an interesting thing here, which is it creates a kind of virtual object database. Okay, of course, Wikipedia is a little bit academic, but it provides a good example here. First of all, is my screen okay for you? I forgot to ask you before recording. Are you seeing it okay? All right. And if you have questions during the webinar, of course, you can ask questions there. If I can answer right away, I will answer. Otherwise, I will answer at the end of the webinar or when I can. And if I forget some questions at some point, please redo the question. I appreciate that if you do that in case I forget to answer some questions you might have. All right. So the example that Wikipedia provides to us is this. A regular way to save and retrieve data from a database is using SQL statements. And in this example, it's very simple. It's executing with some language here. It's not Delphi, but it doesn't matter. For us to understand the ORM concept is that it's trying to retrieve data from a database, select some columns from a table where a condition is met, and retrieve the result. In this case here, it's retrieving the first name of the result set. All right. In contrast, it says this code here is an ORM way to do the same thing. So in another way, it's instead of executing a SQL statement, it's asking some repository to retrieve a person object given an ID 10. The logic is the same of SQL statement, which you can see here that it's retrieving data from the SQL statement where ID equals 10, from table persons where ID equals 10. And the ORM does the same, but instead it asks for an object. So give me an object person with ID 10 and get the first name from a property there. Okay. And here is another example in a visual way. The ORM, in this case, it's mentioned in Hibernate, which is an ORM framework for Java. You have here your database, student database, with the fields at the right side of the screen, with the fields and its data types and its content. And the ORM is the middle tier, is the intermediate layer that converts data back and forth to an object. In this case, of course, it's presenting data as a Java object, but you can extrapolate to a Delphi object. So the data from the database here, it's converted, read and written, to an object of class students with the same, with fields or properties that will hold the value from the database. All right. I hope this is clear. I believe if you are here, of course, you already have an interest in ORM, and you probably know about this concept here. So why use an ORM? What are the advantages and the disadvantages, the pros and cons of using an ORM? If you look, I have gathered some websites here, 4 or 5, exactly searching for Google for pros and cons of an ORM. And if you do, I'll just go quick here. But if you do a summary, you see that the lists have many things in common. So, for example, this website here says that the advantage of using ORM is, instead of direct SQL statements, all right, is that you write in the language you already using anyway. That means if you are talking about Delphi, Pascal Delphi, you are coding your persistent layer, you're saving and loading data from the database using Pascal instead of an additional language, which is SQL statements, which is SQL, all right? And it abstracts the database, and you have many advantage features, etc. And the advantage says that if you are a master of SQL, you can probably get more performant queries by writing them yourself. There is an overhead involved in learning and using an ORM, okay? And if you go to other lists, you see the same. For example, an advantage, this website here, this Stack Overflow answer says that with an ORM, you don't repeat yourself. You have a better structured language to handle, better structured way to handle data, which is using your language. You don't have to write poorly formed SQL statement, etc. It's also flexible because it abstracts the database system and blah, blah, blah. And again, the disadvantage is that ORM libraries are not lightweight tools. Performance is okay, but a SQL master will do better. So we see a pattern here. And again, another website says an advantage of ORM is productivity, application design, code reuse, reduced testing, and disadvantage is performance and need to know SQL statements. And again, in summary, what you see is that using ORM, nobody disagrees that using an ORM speeds up development, reduce development time, it makes your application more structured, it's easier to work with, and the disadvantages are mostly the performance, if you have a bad ORM, the overhead, of course, you have an overhead over SQL statements, and of course, there are minor disadvantages, which is normal, like you have to learn a new tool and things like that, okay? And again, the last one, improve development efficiency, reduce development costs. So I believe by now, you can understand that if you want to have a better application, if you want to reduce development costs, if you want to increase productivity, improve testing, ORM is a very good option for you to save and load data from the database. What are the scenarios where it's not useful or it can fire back? Which is if you have a need for a high performance application where each milliseconds matter, that you have to load and save lots and lots of millions of records, and a small 3% or 5% loss in performance will cause an effect on you. So you see that not many applications need such kind of performance, but many applications, especially, well, even small ones, but complex applications you have to maintain for a long time, that you have to improve, that you have to change, that you want to prototype faster, you will benefit from using an ORM. All right. So for this webinar here, I always suffer for explaining this, what is an ORM, especially the advantages and pros, because what you see here is a lot of talking, but if you are new to ORM, you never relate. It's difficult to relate these advantages to real world, how I will benefit in my software to understand. So I tried to do another analogy for the first time. I talk about an analogy, which is, I'm trying to, no. Okay. To do an analogy between ORM and VCL. You guys know that VCL, the Visual Component Library for Delphi, is a wrapper around Windows APIs, okay? These controls you have here in our application, at least in the VCL application, are Windows controls, all right? This is Windows operation system itself creating the buttons, and the drawing, everything is done by Windows. So all we have to take to create a button here is just called API Windows. So the first button you saw there at the left was created just calling a single method, a single Windows API function, create window. Okay, this is Windows API, no intermediate layer. I'm creating a window control of type button with caption OK, with some properties at the position 10, 10, with the size here, etc., etc. And that's it. And for us to do the same with Delphi, with the VCL, we have to create a tip button class. We have to set some properties here. This is the caption. Here is the position of the button. Here's the parents. They will be honored by the form. And we do the same thing. We create the same buttons. It's not exactly the same because there is some defaults that the VCL changes. You see the font is different, but it's the same thing. So I ask you, why would you need the VCL if we can call Windows API directly? It should be even more performatic, I think, because there is no overhead. If you debug it here, T button create, it's amazing how much extra code it's executed just to create a single button. Take a look. Setting properties and creating internal objects, taking lots of memory, creating internal objects, tip padding, and calling a lots of, this is just to create the class, and then set bounds and lots of Windows messages just to set bounds. If you, of course, I didn't calculate it, but it's like 500 lines being executed instead of one. Still, what do you prefer to use? Do you prefer to create your Windows controls this way or this way? Of course, I believe most of you will say this way. Let's use the VCL. It's easier. It's a higher level. We work with objects. It's much easier to debug. It's harder to have bugs. It's easier to develop. It's easier to maintain. It's easier if a second developer takes over our existing code. And there is a lot of overhead. You have seen that there's lots of not useful properties being set, not needed for this specific thing. And still we prefer to use it like that. Okay. Of course, we also prefer to use it like that because VCL is a great framework. If it was a framework that will get in the way, it was limited, that we had to all the time go back to low level and do Windows APIs, we'll ask ourselves, why do I need the VCL if I have all the time? If it does help me on 10% of my job, and all the time I have to go to the Windows API to tweak things, to do things that is not predicted in the framework. All right. So that's the analogy. An ORM, and especially TMS Aurelius, it's a kind of VCL for the database. Just like the VCL wraps the Windows API for visual controls, ORM, TMS Aurelius wraps your database for you, the SQL statements, the internal API calls, cursors, as an object structure. All right? This is the first time I'm using this analogy, and I hope it's better for you to have an idea of how, in long term and even in prototype, using an ORM is beneficial for you. Okay? If you have any questions, please let me know. Does anyone use, Peter is asking, does anyone use it, any kind of ORM ever? Sorry, what do you mean? I didn't understand your question. ORM is all the time used, of course. Okay. So, all right. Yes, we are all here trying to see if an ORM fits for you. All right. And another thing is that most of you, I believe most of you have already created, if you work with database applications, and I believe most of you do, you have already done some kind of ORM in the sense of object relational mapping. You have mapped objects to your relational data. James is saying, I've never used one. I thought I am now realizing that I kind of grow my own by instinct. Exactly. That's what I'm going to, that's what I mentioned now. So let me open a blank application that I have previously saved here. Okay. Just for the sake of saving time, we have a blank VCL application here. So if I create some unit here, let me save it and call it entities. And I will create an object here. The one that I use all the time, but it can be whatever you want. So let's call it customer and say it has an ID. Sorry, I messed it up here. FID of type integer, read FID, write FID, and a name. All right. This is, like Jamie said, this is what, at least the most, you probably have done this, the most basic one. You have a data set here, like FD query. And let me use an entity here, entities, our user unit. And you have probably done something like this, customer, T-customer, and said, I'll not create it here because it's just an example, but customer equals to FD query 1, field by name, name as a string. All right. Probably you have done something like that. You have to use, most of the time, if you do not use an ORM, most of the time you use data sets, you bind your data sets to visual controls, or you interact with your data set with while, not, off, end of file, etc. And you read field by name, etc. But sometimes you realize that if you put your data in an object, it will be easier for you to perform some operations in your software, because then you can use this customer here, object here, and say, do some processing and pass the customer there, so you don't have to pass lots of fields in the parameters, or you don't have to pass the data set and keep your data set open. So you sometimes you have to take data from your data sets and put somewhere in Pascal. Okay, so as James said, you sometimes grow your own ORM by instinct. Okay, so you're doing an ORM here, and some of you and some other developers might have increased this and make it more complex. Maybe you got tired of setting properties one by one, and you kind of use some dynamic way to set properties dynamically. We're using RTTI from the fields and things like that. So you are evolving, creating your own internal ORM framework, even if you didn't realize that, or even if the code is not separated as a ORM library, but it is mixed with your application. Still, you are mapping relational with objects. All right. There are some interesting questions here that I like to go through before moving forward. Does the ORM, Ken is asking, does the ORM get all the columns even if you need only one or two? Again, that's an ORM. It's a concept. As I said, you are doing this here. So does this ORM get all the columns? So it depends on the framework, all right? Speaking about TMS Aurelius specifically, TMS Aurelius is very powerful. You see that the reason it's been used and it's very well regarded in Delphi community, it's simply because it's mature and it's full featured, all right? There are lots of things you can do with Aurelius that you can tweak. I will show some things here, of course, basic things. But the point is that in long term, it pays off because it's been evolved and it's very complete. So in Aurelius, there are ways for you to get some columns from the database instead of the full object. And if you have a covering index for the particular query, does this still read the entire row? Okay, the same questions. Can we live without SQL thanks to ORM, or still need SQL? Can you work with the Vcl without using Windows APIs? Okay. You have always, not always, but you might have a need often to hey guys, wait a minute, I have a dog here. Are hearing it, but there was a little dog here crying. So where I was. Okay. Sometimes you have to use SQL statements. Sometimes you want to use SQL statements. That's another point, especially for most ORMs, but especially about TMS Aurelius. It's not an all or nothing, all right? You can have most of your application using ORM, getting benefiting of it by creating objects, passing objects here back and forth. But you can always execute SQL statements, just like you can have 99% of your Vcl application, of your Windows application, desktop application, using the Vcl, but then you have a specific control that the Vcl doesn't provide, or that you want to fine tune, and you create the control yourself by calling Windows APIs. All right. So don't take it as an all or nothing. Take it as a tool where you can abstract SQL statements most of the time. You can benefit from it using getting all the advantage it provides. But if you need SQL statements, go for it. That's exactly, Peter is saying, SQL statement is not scary. That's not the point of fear of SQL statement. It's just the point of benefiting from what an ORM brings to you. Patrick is saying, I have close contact with Patrick. He said, I use it to program spaghetti code. Now I gain a lot of time in bringing it to ORM and reuse it a lot, etc. Okay. Source utilization. Better to have a dog than a bug. All right, guys, you are talking between you. Great. So I hope it's clear now. And let's see how TMS Aurelius works for you, the beginners. So, okay, I created my customer class here. And because I need, for some reason, I need data in the object way, this way, but I don't want to do this kind of manual mapping anymore. I want to use Orm, I want to use TMS Aurelius. So what should I do? First of all, if you are starting with the classes, you can build your classes like I did here. And I can simply say that this class here is an Aurelius class and do an auto mapping for you. The mapping in ORM means how this class will be saved to the database and how it will be retrieved. So the mapping contains all the meta information about instances of this object here, which table they will be saved to, how this ID property will be saved, in which column, database column, what are the indexes, how to calculate a new primary key. There is a lot of mapping that you can do here, at least in Aurelius. It's a subject for a full webinar, but there is a nice quick and dirty, not dirty actually, there's a nice, very quick way to start with, is just saying that this object is going to be persisted in the database and do some auto mapping for you, at least to start with, okay? And of course, we have to use the units here. Okay, so we have our class mapped. So what should I do now? Sorry, my Delphi hanged. Why it come back to life? I will. Okay. Before I continue, I must say that this is the approach we call code first, which is I create a class and then I code my database application from it. And there is the opposite, which is the database first, which is I create my database first, or I have an existing database, and then I want to start with ORM from it. If that's the case, you can, again, you can create your class here and say with lots of attributes. For example, I can say, oh, this customer here will be saved to my table customers, which is already in the database using that name, all right? So imagine that you have an existing database with data like this, with ID and names, and you have the table named like this. You can simply map it, use a lot of attributes to tell Aurelius how to fit to your existing database. And there is this data modeler tool here, which is a tool that imports a database structure. And from that, you can get your full database. Even if you have 100 tables, it can extract metadata from your database, and it can create Aurelius classes for you. Let me try to do a simple example here if I have. Yeah, for example, this is an existing database. This is the Northwind database structure here. It was imported from like existing database. So you have, this tool has all the information about all tables, customers table here, etc. And you can create the classes for TMS Aurelius from here. So you see that it creates a class for each table I have in my database. So this is the table categories, and it said it's saving the table here, lots of fields, and it's mapping to the real actual database there, okay? But let's start simple, and let's just take our customer class here and see what we can do with it. Since we don't have a database, we can ask Aurelius to create a database for us. For that, there is a component here, call it Aurelius DB schema. And this Aurelius DB schema requires a connection. Of course, we have to tell Aurelius where our database is. TMS Aurelius connection. So let's associate our schema with the connection. And how do we connect to the database? There are lots of options here. We can connect directly to the database via Aurelius with using its native drivers. For now, there are 2 drivers available, SQLite and SQL Server. And more native drivers are coming. But you can simply use your existing database access component. So it supports all of these components that you can use. So Absolute DB, AnyDeck, DB Express, DBGo, Elevate DB, FireDeck, of course, which is the most popular option for Delphi right now. UniDeck, it's another useful option. So you can simply use the database connection that you want. So if I want to drop a FD connection here and configure the connection to the database as I wish for all the databases that it supports, and then I can simply come here and say, okay, I'm going to connect to my database using FD connection. Okay. So that's very simple. And in this example here, let's start with the native driver for SQLite. And let me put the database here in the d webinar.db. Enable foreign keys. Test connection. The database has been created actually. And let's put a button here. Since the connection is configured, all we need to do is Aurelius DB schema1 dot update database. Okay. That's just it. Here you see that the linker, we remove the T customer from here. So to avoid it, I can register entity here. This is not needed if you are using the customer in your application, which we'll do in a minute. But since we don't have it here, the linker will remove it. So let's avoid that. Can I use Aurelius with interbase but not using your native driver? Yes, exactly. You can connect to the interbase using FireDAC, IB Express, IB objects, and use it with your interbase. Does Aurelius work in C++? Unfortunately not, Ken. Yes, I will show how to visualize data. All right, let's run it here. Execute and close. And let's see. I open the SQLite tool here that can browse the database to see what happened. Open database. It's in our D drive, webinar.db. And you see that it has created a customer named table. It executed the SQL statement here. Oops, not this one. This one, DDL, create table customer. This is the design of our table. We have on the column ID, a column name, and it's there. Again, the name of the table, the name of the columns, the data type, all this is configured. The primary keys, foreign keys, etc. But since we use it auto mapping, you have seen that Aurelius using its convention, and it's already created our tables. So our database is ready to be used, and the components, the objects to use to manipulate objects written from the database is the Aurelius manager. So if we put an edit here, let's put a button and name it Save. And let's do this. Customer. Let's create a new customer. Let's say its name is edit1.text. And let's just use the Aurelius Manager 1. Save customer. All right. And we can even, in the button 2, and show the generated ID. All right, I forgot to set the connection. Here in Aurelius Manager, I set to the same Aurelius connection. ID 1, okay? If you go to the database here, we'll see data. It's there. We have seen that it has saved our object in the database, okay? So the object was put in the database. And the same way we can retrieve some data here. I'll not spend much time here anymore. Just mention that the Aurelius Manager 1 here has lots of options here, which is delete, remove, refresh, update, flush. Of course, this is not, we cannot learn about TMS Aurelius in deep in this webinar, this introduction, but just for you to know that with this manager, you do all the operations with the database, delete the CRUD operations, and you can do select. This is a very interesting one. You can do a find, for example, I want to find the customer with ID 2, and especially you have a very complex query system here, so you can use it, for example, where name contains WAG, for example. So you can do or name contains John, okay? And order by name, for example. So here you start to see the difference between an internally made ORM or a very basic ORM framework with a full feature framework, which is Aurelius really allows you to abstract from the database. It's like the VCL example. Suppose that you have a VCL that just has the basic buttons, the basic Windows controls, like a button, an edit, and a checkbox. So if you need a grid, if you need a tree view, if you need a list view, you have to do it yourself. So it's not a framework that helps you that much. And it's the same thing here. Imagine that you have a framework that allows you to save and load data from the database like this. But then when you have to do complex queries and you have to order your data, you have to go fall back to SQL statements. So you can use it, but you might ask yourself, it's not bringing me that much benefit. All right. So Aurelius, in this example here, Aurelius you can really write full queries. You can retrieve data in complex ways using the object-oriented paradigm. You are still coding in as object. This, for example, this is the name of the property, not of the database fields. You are asking for objects of type customer where property name contains bag or the name contains John, order by the property ID, etc. All right. Another interesting concept is the concept of foreign keys associations, which is if I have a customer and a country, for example, in the database, in the flat relational database, you use foreign keys to map, to relate a customer, for example, to a country. And in the case of an ORM, especially Aurelius, you just use object references, okay? So you can, for example, say that your customer relates to the country. Let's see what you can do here now. See, that's another advantage. Our database was updated with a single click. So now we have a table named country, and we have now a new field, a new column in the customer table, which is country ID, which is a foreign key to the country table. All right? This is how relationships work with Aurelius. And it's very interesting because when you retrieve an object, when you say this to Aurelius, bring me Aurelius Manager 1, find a customer with ID 1, I can already tell what is the country name is by doing something like this. All right? So you, again, you work with object structures, you care about the objects. Bring me a customer, what is the data related to this object, to this customer? Oh, it has a country related to it. Bring me the country. What is the ID of the country? What's the name of the country? And does this country have another association? If yes, zip code point.id, all right? This is very object-oriented programming, okay? And someone asked about visual controls. It's a kind of tree structure that you use this in the foreign keys. Now, let's remove this and see. This is the concept, all right? What I'm going to show you here is our tools, red tools that you can use with Aurelius. There is a nice component named T-Aurelius dataset, which is often misunderstood because of the name, the dataset, it might be taken as a component that you use to read and write data from the database. But that's not true, because you have seen that the communication with the database is Aurelius Manager. You have seen that. Aurelius dataset is just a way for you to bind the objects to data-aware controls. So for example, since it's a regular dataset, I can bind any DB control to it, a DB grid, for example. And I can use a data source. So I can bind the grids to the data source, and the data source to the data set. Okay? But as I said, the data set doesn't bring data from the database. We have to tell him where the data comes from. So caption data sets. We can do something like this. Aurelius Manager 1, find customers. Okay? As we've seen, I can ask for a customer of with ID 1, or I can do some queries here, or I can simply ask for the general list. Bring me all the customers you have in the database. Since we have very few here, let's bring everyone, every customer. Of course, you have to filter in a real application, so not bring all the table with you. So what it takes is Aurelius dataset 1, set source list. So let's provide a list to the data set, a list of objects, okay? Just an in-memory list. And let's open it. And there we have our tools that makes our life easier, okay? This is not ORM specifically, it's just that the ORM brought the objects to us, but then we use the data set to make it very easy to interact with the existing Delphi ecosystem, the DB grids, the reports, and every single component and framework that interacts with data sets the good old Delphi way. You can use that. You can use those structures, that ecosystem with TMS Aurelius. Okay, and if we associate the Aurelius data set with the manager, which is actually the object that does the saving for us. Aurelius data set. Let me remove that self field. Then we can use it to modify data. So I can do this, Bruno, John, James, Peter, and Shane, Wagner. And if you go to our database here, there, all right? So under the hood, the data set is updating the objects in memory, and the manager is saving and updating those objects in the database, all in a ready way. So there is actually not much excuse to not use TMS Aurelius, because it brings you all the benefits you have with an ORM, but you almost don't lose the speed, the RAD, all the benefits you already have using Delphi. Okay, so this is how you have an idea of how to use database controls. And okay, I want to give you an examples. I want to tell you about examples of the ORM ecosystem. So kind of try to explain the benefits. There is not much sense here in learning how to use specifically TMS Aurelius. That's not the objective, the purpose of this webinar, because there is no time, of course. But the idea is to introduce you to ORM and give you an idea of what it can do for you. I have said lots of things here, but some other examples. The fact that you have an ORM, especially in Aurelius, where we at TMS are trying to create an ecosystem around TMS Aurelius, because we can, because that's the advantage of an ORM. So, for example, a recent feature that has been implemented was filtering. That brings a lot of, that makes it very, very easy to create multi-tenant applications. What is a multi-tenant application? It's something that you divide your data. For example, I have a tenant ID here. So for example, you can have a multi-company software. So your software holds a list of customers, but depending on who logs in your application, for example, I'm user John from company Google, and I log in your system, and I'm John from Google. I can only see and modify and delete customers from Google, not from Microsoft, for example. So if the customer is from Google or Microsoft, it's saved in this tenant ID field, for example. And in a regular application, SQL application, you have to imagine that you have an existing application and you have to turn it into a multi-tenant application. You have to create tenant IDs fields in all your tables, and you have to review all your SQL statements in your application. If you have some application, some SQL statements like select from customers, and of course you have where blah, blah, blah. And of course you have much more complex and lots of SQL statements like this. You have to add n tenant ID equals some parameter. You have to review your SQL statements. You have to set these parameters manually. Imagine the amount of effort and the amount of how error prone is this approach is. With Aurelius and with any ORM, with most ORMs, that they might implement this feature because we have all the information about the database in a structural way with objects. So we can simply say, for example, that there is a filter named Multi-Tenant, which is the default condition is tenant ID equals tenant ID, and that this parameter for this filter is of type string. Okay, this can be put once. For example, I can put it here in the customer in the class country, and for all classes that I want to have this filter by default here, this filter enabled, I can say, okay, this entity here can have the multi-tenant field applied. Okay, and whenever I want this filter to be applied, I simply go there and say enable filter multi-tenant and Microsoft. So that's pretty much it. Actually, it's set param tenant ID. Okay, that's just that. You are saying to Aurelius, okay, whatever objects you are loading or saving to the database here, please apply this filter for any class. So if I have flagged my table, my class customers, invoices, orders, addresses, whatever, and those classes have the multi-tenant filter, every retrieval of those objects will filter out only for Microsoft invoices, Microsoft products, Microsoft customers. Just load and save. If you save a customer, it will automatically save that customer as Microsoft. So that's just it. Compare this with using SQL statements, all right? So that's the kind of things you benefit in medium term, in short term, and in long term. In short term, you have seen that I have created my database easily. I have already my data in objects. But in long term, you see that things are easier to do, are easier to maintain, and even new features. This is a recent feature, for example. So Aurelius customers got this automatically, so to speak. And this is an example in Aurelius itself. We have lots of tools and products and frameworks that benefit from Aurelius. Xdata, in an example, Xdata is our REST server framework. So you can build REST servers with it. You don't need TMS Aurelius, right? You can build your TMS REST server using Xdata. But if you want, you can already get these entities here and turn them into endpoints. So you can already, with a single click, you can create a REST server that allows you to, via JSON and HTTP, create customers, create invoices, retrieve customers with query, because you're already using Aurelius. We have TMS Echo, that is a replication system. So this application here, for example, I can make it replicatable also with a few lines of code here. That means that this application that I have just built, I can configure it to save data in my local database SQLite here, and offline send data to a central server in SQL Server, for example, and replicate data back and forth. Just as simple as using this multi-tenant filter here, because we are using Aurelius. There is TMS Xalt, which is a user management system. You can add login, privileges, authorization system just because you are using TMS Aurelius. So there are lots of satellite products that you can use and use it very easily if your application is using TMS Aurelius. All right. Okay, let me go through some questions. In this example, how can we modify the country property from the DB grid? Okay, I'll try to do that example later. We have already 1 hour of webinar, so let's go through your questions you might have. And from now on, I'll make this more interactive for those who want to stay. And we see if you have still have some minutes, we see how to answer your questions in a more practical way. So how does transaction control work? Okay, we have a question about foreign keys, modify an associated object, and we have a question about transactions. I will show this. And beside this, do you have any comments? This is what I wanted to show you, all right? So this is where the official webinar ends. I hope you have enjoyed it before my examples, before my answering the questions. I hope you have enjoyed TMS Aurelius, and I hope my purpose here was to show you what ORM is and the benefits it can bring. I hope that I have showed that for you, that you can see how an ORM, regardless if it's Aurelius or not, but of course, I hope you like it, Aurelius, how you can benefit from an ORM, and how such tool can improve the quality of your code. Okay, so let's go through the questions. The country question is a very good one, and even though it takes a little more time, I will show it because it's a source of confusion for many users. Here's one idea here. From the bottom, let me create a code here that creates a new customer. Let's say customer name is Jack. And let's create a country here. The country.create. And the country is German, for example. Okay. And here's how we associate. We have 2 different objects. Each object is representing one row in the table. And we say that, as we have seen, the association is via object. We have a country property in our customer class. So we just do this. Okay? We take an instance of the country and set it to the customer. And then we save it. Save customer. Aurelius has a cascade mechanism that we know that this Germany country is not in the database, all right? So we are saving a customer that doesn't exist and a country that doesn't exist. Aurelius automatically knows that, and via cascade, given it knows the associations between the objects, it knows that, sorry guys, it knows that it has to save the country before you can save the customer. Okay. I haven't updated the database. Let's remove this. Okay. So if you go to the database, we see that we have a new country named German. So we asked Aurelius to save the customer, and Aurelius said, okay, I have to save the country first. That country is ID 1. And then when I save Jack, I say that the country is 1. Okay? That's the relation. And If you want to save another one, for example, I want to say Joe, save Joe, and the country already exists, so I can simply ask the manager, give me the country of ID1, or the country named Germany. Okay. And again, I use save Joe. And Joe will also be from Germany. Okay. So how do I show this in a data set? I can do something like this. Just like a regular data set, I can set fields here, and each field represents a property of the object. So if I'm retrieving the customer and I have just created a field, okay. Huh. See, it's trying to filter the tenant IDs. We don't want that. Let's remove this filter here. So our data set is just showing the name property because that's what we asked it to do. And with the data set, you can show properties of the main object, but also from the sub-objects. So there are many ways to do that. I will show you the more straightforward one, but there are other ways. But I will say that I want the objects until the associated objects until the first level. The default was 0, but now I want the first level. You see what happens here. It will show the names, but it will also show the properties of the associated objects. So I see here that the first customers here have no countries, and the two last ones, the country is Germany. Okay. As I said, I can make it easier to see if, for example, I create a field, name it country.name and name. So it's just a regular data set. And again, this is just visual binding. Okay. There you go. I have the name and the country. And there are many different ways you can set the country. The concept of setting the country is this. It's always setting the object reference. Okay. But the binding system benefits from, for example, the lookup fields. So I can, for example, create another data set. In that data set, I can say, okay, this Aurelius data set 2 here, let's some criteria. Aurelius manager 1, find country. So let's open a list of countries. And I can say, for example, that there is a field named country of type string 50. It's a lookup. And the key field is the dataset field is Aurelius dataset 2. There is no time to go into details here. Let's see if, just to show you how it works. here, this is the field that you use. So for example, I want to say that Bruno is also from Germany. I can just go here and say, so visually it looks like the regular lookup. You are doing associations, but Aurelius dataset makes it in a way that what you are doing behind the curtains is this. You are setting the object reference. Okay? No time to explain this, but this is more or less what happened. So here, Bruno is from Germany now. Okay. So to answer the question, the concept of foreign keys is using object references, and visually binding, you can use lookup fields. All right. The other question was about transactions. This is very simple. You can use transactions just like a regular database. You have this something named IDB transaction. And you can simply go to Aurelius connection 1. Oh, no, sorry. You get the manager, connection, begin transaction. That's it. Try, there's no much secret here. Try accept, rollback, or commits. That's it, as simple as that. It abstracts, of course, the database for you. Okay. Another benefit, for example, if I want to migrate this to SQL Server, for example, I just set another connection to SQL Server. The server is blah, 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 and it creates the database in SQL Server, and that's it. Your application is now working with SQLite and SQL Server and whatever database you want. Okay. So let's go through the questions. Richard, webinar definitely beneficial. We could keep you going with examples for hours. Yeah, I know that. It's true. I could stay here for hours, of course. There are lots of things to do. Actually, I'm preparing an online course, several online courses about TMS Aurelius. Some of them I will publish it for free on my website, landgraph.dev. Please subscribe there to get news, and there will be more complete ones also about TMS Aurelius and Nextdata. Is there a trial for this, and how long does it last? Yes, there is a trial. Here is the official TMS Aurelius website. And I forgot to tell you one last thing before you go, and before I keep answering questions. It's very easy, of course. If you Google for TMS Aurelius, here's the first link is the website. You have downloads here. Here. Downloads. You have trial downloads for all Delphi versions since XE2. Just download and install it. The trial doesn't have a specific expiration period, but it's for sure more than a month. The only limitation is that the application you generate will expire at some point. But that's the whole point of this webinar, actually. The motivation for this webinar is that we have Aurelius Academic Edition. So you can use the trial. The trial has no technical limitation. You can just test. It has all the features that TMS Aurelius provides. TMS Aurelius is a commercial software, so you can try. You can buy it, a license for you. And now you have TMS Aurelius Academic Edition. Also, if you Google for it or go to TMS software website and search for it, there is this link here, TMS Web Academy. Oh, sorry, not this one. TMS Aurelius Academic Edition. And there is a blog post about it. Okay. But you can simply go to TMS Academic Program. You can also search for it. tmssoftware.com/site/academic. And we have several TMS products that are provided as an academic license. The first one to be provided was Vcl UI Pack. Then we have FNC UI Pack, TMS Web Core, TMS FlexCell, and now TMS Aurelius is also available with the academic edition. So if you are a student, if you are a teacher, if you work in an academic environment, just register for it using your academic email, and you get the license for academic use for free to learn, to understand, and to learn how to use Aurelius or use Aurelius to learn the concepts of an ORM. Okay. Nala is mentioning if we used some third-party case tool to design and create a database, what are options to map it to ORM with Aurelius, so we don't have to do it manually? I've showed it to you. The idea is to use the TMS. Actually, let me show it for you. You can use the TMS data modeler tool, or you can use directly from the IDE. For example, I have a connection here, and let's point to an existing SQL server. And there is a database Northwind here, I believe. It's LocalDB. I always confuse myself here. Sorry, guys, it will take some time here. It's LocalDB. Test connection. Okay. So I have connected to a database, and I can use it, generate entities from database. Okay. So this is an existing database you have created with your case tool, and it lists for me the tables it finds. I can choose the tables that I want to generate or not, and click OK. There's lots of options there to fine-tune your generation, but that's it. You have your classes mapped to your database, and that's it. From now on, you can do just as we did using your existing data. If the country is blocked from DB to domain, could it save the customer? Thomas, you mean about the filter, the multi-tenant filter? If yes, then no. If you have filtered your manager to use this tenant is Microsoft, you cannot associate a customer Microsoft with a country from Google, for example. The country will simply not appear. Okay. Tool to convert C# Entity Framework Core to Aurelius. Sorry, there is no such tool, unfortunately. There is no such tool. I don't know actually any tool that actually converts pure C# code to Aurelius, even less a full Aurelius framework. All right, guys. No more questions left. If you still have questions, I'll be here for a while, for some minutes. And this presentation is being recorded, and it will be available in our YouTube channel. And if you have still questions, I'll be here. If not, thanks for coming. Can we have 2 different classes for the same table? Yes, but in different models. There is the concept of model. So for example, I can have this model here 1. Okay, so you choose, this is useful, for example, if you want to have one single application to access different databases, but it's also a logical way to separate your code. You can say this class is here is under model 1, this class is here is under model 2, and you choose which model you are going to work with, depending on the part of your application. And you can have different countries from different models pointing to the same table. Does Aurelius prevent SQL injection attacks? That's for sure. That's another advantage of using an ORM, is that it prevents SQL injection in a much more efficient way than SQL statements, because internally, all the parameters, all the data sent to the database are sent via parameters. The SQL statement is never modified directly with the parameters input by customers, at least for TMS Aurelius. If there are other ORMs that do not do that, that's a problem. But with TMS Aurelius, we always use parameters. How we can see the SQL query running? Good question. It's very easy. Let me go back to the previous application. I can use a component here, model events. Here, let's add some memo here. And these are global Aurelius events for a specific model. So here we have, for example, here we have notifications of all operations that are performed by Aurelius. When a record is deleted, inserted, updated. So here, for example, is just a simple centralized way you can use to do a tracking, to log all the modifications in your database. From here, you can save a log of all the modifications that you've done in a few lines of code. And one of the events is on SQL statement executing. So it's fired whenever a SQL statement is executed. We can inspect the parameters as well, but let's keep just with the SQL statements. So dataset select, okay? If, for example, let's do something interesting here. Let's change the country of this customer here. So you see update customer, set country ID equals something where ID is something. And you note that it only modifies the fields that are modified, of course. It only includes in the SQL statement the fields that have been modified. So for example, Maria, update customer, set name. So in the first update, it only modified the country ID field, and now only the name field. It knows what has been modified to perform small queries. Richard is saying a suggestion. I still get tripped up with real-life programming scenarios. For example, often I have the need to retrieve only some of the fields from a given table, the need to join few tables. Yeah, the point is just we have already 1 hour and 20. I consider this a long webinar. I think an ideal webinar runs from 30 to 1 hour, 30 minutes to 1 hour. And it's just too much information. That's why I'm planning to do some training courses here to go in a more slower pace with a more target audience, so we can go into details. All right. Well, that's it. Again, tmssoftware.com for our loading TMS Aurelius. My personal website, I hope you go there and subscribe to get news. I will not spam you, I promise. It's just that for you to know about new upcoming training courses that I'm creating. So landgraph.dev, courses.landgraph.dev. And yes, I'm trying to. There is a plan to do lots of new courses. It's been a long time, but we will update. Which is the most efficient way to get a list of records with Aurelius and put them in a TFD memory table? Dimitris, let's talk via support, okay? Mostly, it's just using the objects and filling the FD memory. Jochen, I hope I have pronounced your name correctly. I have been using Aurelius for 3 years now. I think it was a very good decision to use it in larger projects. Thank you for your feedback. And I'm glad you are enjoying it. All right, guys. Thank you very much for coming here. And I hope we meet in a future webinar. Stay tuned for upcoming webinars. Subscribe to tmssoftware.com newsletter too to know about the upcoming webinars, upcoming product releases. And this webinar will be recorded, will be available in YouTube. And thank you very much for coming.